"Your clothes are getting everything dirty. Get out," yelled the millionaire CEO of the luxury dealership, humiliating the old farmer who was looking at the cars. Judging him by the mud on his boots, he expelled him in front of all the customers. The farmer, without saying a word, simply placed his old, worn briefcase on the marble counter and opened it. The CEO looked inside, expecting to find fruits or tools, but what he saw made him pale and go into complete shock. The white marble floor of the Empire Motors showroom in Manhattan gleamed with an almost celestial intensity, reflecting the LED spotlights that highlighted the perfect curves of the world's most coveted automobiles. Each vehicle was a sculpture of metal and luxury, a monument to speed and power. For J.R., the CEO who had inherited the business and multiplied its worth, this perfection wasn't just a standard, it was a religion. At 35, he commanded a true empire, a fortune built upon the solid foundation his father had left, but which his own ambition had transformed into a tower of ivory and glass. He hated, with a silent, profound fury, anything out of place. A fingerprint on the hood of a Ferrari, a speck of dust on the Persian rug in his office. It was all a personal affront to his worldview. Wealth, for him, wasn't measured merely in the numbers in a bank account or the value of his Wall Street stocks. It was measured in the flawless, overwhelming demonstration of superiority. On that Tuesday afternoon, the harmony of his sanctuary was brutally shattered. The automatic glass door slid open to admit a figure who seemed to have been torn from another universe. He was an elderly man, his skin weathered by the sun, and his shoulders stooped from a lifetime of labor. His clothes, simple and worn, were stained with the red Texas clay that seemed to have been his lifelong companion. His boots, heavy and dull, left a trail, subtle, but to J.R., scandalous, of dried mud with every step he took across the immaculate marble. Mr. Abner, oblivious to the looks of repulsion he was drawing, walked with a surprising calm, his clear eyes scanning the room before settling on the most expensive sports car on the floor. A red Italian that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. For J.R., that was the last straw. This presence was an insult, a smudge on his perfect canvas. He marched toward the man, his designer suit cutting through the air-conditioned atmosphere like a blade. "Your clothes are filthying up my showroom. Get out!" J.R.'s voice echoed through the reverent silence, laced with a contempt that made a few clients turn away, embarrassed. "Oh, this is no place for people like you. Security, get this man out of here now." The humiliation was public, deliberate. The other clients, men and women dressed in the uniform of the Manhattan elite, looked at Mr. Abner with a mixture of disgust and amusement. Two tall, uniformed security guards began to approach, ready to carry out the order without question. The rancher, however, with a calm that infuriated J.R. even further, simply raised one wrinkled hand, a simple gesture that held an unexpected authority, bidding the guards to wait. He spoke no further words to the CEO. Instead, he turned and walked slowly to the main reception desk, where a young woman watched him, paralyzed. With a dull thud, he placed his old, cracked leather briefcase on the delicate glass countertop. "What is it?" J.R. sneered, following him, a cruel smile on his face. "You going to try and trade me a couple of chickens for it?" Mr. Abner didn't reply. He just unfastened the worn metal clasps of the briefcase, and what he revealed made the air in the showroom grow thin. There was no money inside. It was stuffed with bundles of old promissory notes, contracts, and on top, a single land deed, yellowed with age. "You don't recognize me, do you, Mr. Powell, Jr.?" the rancher said, his voice now firm, resonating with a strength that belied his appearance. "I'm Abner Hayes. Do you know who I am?" J.R., confused and irritated, glanced at his manager, Arthur, who had quietly approached. Arthur's face was as white as the marble beneath his feet. He leaned in and whispered, his voice trembling with dread, Sir, that's the Cattle King. He's the biggest land baron in the state. He owns the land under all our dealerships in the heartland. J.R. Say's smile didn't fade. It shattered. It froze on his face for a fraction of a second before splintering into a mask of disbelief and contained fury. Arthur's terrified whisper echoed in his mind, each word a hammer blow against the structure of his perfectly constructed world. Cattle King. The moniker sounded like nonsense, a bad joke. This man, with his thick hands and dirt-caked fingernails, couldn't be the bedrock of his empire. The assets of Empire Motors were vast, a complex web of properties, financial instruments, and a robust cash flow that J.R. managed with surgical precision. He was a master of the deal, a multimillionaire who understood stocks, profitability, how to turn capital into more capital. His father had left him a considerable inheritance, but it was he, J.R., who had elevated it to another level, diversifying investments, even dabbling in the volatile cryptocurrency market, always chasing maximum profit. The idea that all of this could depend on an old rancher was simply inconceivable, a grotesque error in his calculations. Mr. Abner, impassive to the silent chaos he had created, pulled the deed from the briefcase and slid it across the counter. The yellowed paper glided over the polished glass, an artifact from another time, colliding with the cold modernity of the place. "I came to do business," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "The lease agreement for all your locations is up today. And after this reception," he paused, his gaze sweeping over the luxury showroom, the clients who now averted their eyes, and J.R. himself with his arrogant posture. "I've decided not to renew. You have 30 days to get all your luxury cars off my land." J.R.'s world didn't collapse. It imploded. The air seemed to be sucked from his lungs. 30 days. It was a death sentence for the majority of his operation. The Heartland dealerships were the backbone of his revenue, the source of the income that fueled his most audacious investments. Without them, his empire would become a house of cards. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in his throat, but he swallowed it down, forcing himself to maintain his composure. Weakness was a luxury he couldn't afford. "This is absurd," J.R. hissed, stepping forward. "A blackmail attempt. My lawyers will destroy you." He tried to sound threatening, but his voice came out weaker than he intended. Arthur, the manager, touched his arm discreetly, a silent warning. "Sir, please," he whispered, his eyes pleading, but J.R. ignored him. He composed himself, puffing out his chest, trying to reclaim control through the only language he truly understood. "Everything has a price," he declared, the arrogance returning like a conditioned reflex. "Name it. I'll double it. Triple the lease value. I can make an international wire transfer right now if you prefer. Dollars, euros, whatever you want. Just name your number." He was confident that money would solve it, as it always did. Every man had a price. It was one of the first lessons his father had taught him about business. To his surprise, Mr. Abner shook his head slowly, a crease of something that looked like sorrow forming between his brows. He looked at J.R., not as an adversary, but as one might observe a spoiled child who still doesn't understand the rules of the game. That look was more destabilizing than any shout. "You think money fixes everything, don't you?" The rancher's voice was low, almost a lament. "You really don't get it. This isn't about your business, Mr. Powell, Jr. It's about your father's debt." Your father's debt. The words hung in the climate-controlled air of the showroom, as heavy and out of place as the figure of Mr. Abner himself. To J.R., this was more than an accusation. It was heresy. His father, James Powell, Sr., had been the architect of his life, the pillar upon which his entire fortune was built. He wasn't just a father, he was a myth, a legend of success and business integrity, a man who turned a small used car lot into a conglomerate that generated astronomical profits. James had taught him the value of hard work, the importance of every cent in the cash flow, the power of a well-placed investment. He was the personification of honor. The idea that his father could owe a debt of any kind to this dirt-stained man was an insult that scratched at the sacred memory he cherished. The legacy he'd received wasn't just money and property, but a flawless name, an inheritance of integrity worth more than any asset on his balance sheet. "My father didn't owe anyone a thing, Jay." Armir's voice came out sharp, a wall of denial rising to protect his father's image. He built this fortune with his own 2 hands, with sweat and intelligence, not with favors or broken promises. This is a trick, a pathetic extortion attempt. He looked at Mr. Abner, expecting to see a flinch, a sign that the bluff had been called, but he found only a steady gaze, tinged with a melancholic patience. "Your father was a good man, Mr. Powell, Jr." "One of the best I ever knew," the rancher replied, and the sincerity in his voice disarmed some of J.R.'s fury, replacing it with a growing confusion. But he made a promise that no amount of money in the world could buy or pay off. With every word, the floor under J.R.'s feet felt more unstable. Arthur, the manager, dared to intervene again, his voice low, almost inaudible. "Mr. Powell, with all due respect, I remember your father, sometimes on the phone, talking about Old Man Hayes from out of state. He spoke with a different kind of respect, a deference he didn't have for anyone else." Arthur's memory was like a small crack in J.R.'s armor. He vaguely recalled, like a distant dream, being a small boy and seeing his father in his grand office, staring out the window for a long time with a worried expression he rarely showed. On that occasion, he had held a yellowed piece of paper, much like the deed now resting on the counter. He had folded it and put it away in an old safe hidden behind a painting. At the time, childish curiosity paid the scene no mind, but now the memory resurfaced with a disturbing clarity. What was that promise? What debt could be so great as to threaten the empire his father built and that he took such pride in having expanded? The public humiliation from minutes ago began to be replaced by a cold, unfamiliar fear. It wasn't the fear of losing his capital or watching his stock value plummet. It was the fear of discovering that the story of his life, the foundation of his identity, was a lie. Mr. Abner seemed to read his thoughts. He pushed the deed back into the briefcase, along with the other papers, and closed the clasps with a definitive snap. "The proof of what I'm saying isn't here with me." He kept it. The old rancher raised his chin and pointed to the imposing oil portrait of James Powell Sr. that dominated the showroom's main wall, a permanent tribute to its founder. "Look for it at his old homestead, the Powell Ranch. In the old office, he kept everything there. You have the same 30 days I gave you to clear out my properties to find the truth. If you find it and decide to honor his word, maybe we can still talk." He turned to leave, leaving J.R. paralyzed in the middle of the showroom. "But if you don't," Abner's voice called from the doorway, "know that you won't just be losing your businesses. You'll be losing the only thing of value your father truly left you." J.R. remained motionless for a long time after the glass door slid shut, leaving behind only the echo of Mr. Abner's words and the nearly invisible traces of red dust on the white marble. The hum of the showroom returned to normal, but for him, the silence was deafening. The portrait of his father on the wall seemed to look down on him with an expression of reproach, the confident, oil-painted smile now seeming to hide a secret. The Powell Ranch. The place was almost a relic, a piece of the past his father had refused to sell, even when financial advisors pointed out that the capital tied up in it could yield much more in hedge funds or on the stock market. For James, the ranch was a sanctuary, the starting point, the symbol of his journey. J.R., on the other hand, saw it as an emotional liability, a reminder of a humble beginning he preferred to forget. He barely visited the place, delegating its management to a trusted foreman and contenting himself with seeing its modest profit figures on the company's annual statement. Now, that forgotten place had become the epicenter of his crisis, the potential chest of a treasure or a curse. That same night, he drove out of the city, breaking the darkness of the interstate in his luxury sedan, a cocoon of leather and technology that insulated him from the outside world. But there was no insulation for his thoughts. Your father's debt. The phrase ricocheted in his mind, each repetition chipping away at the certainty of his world. He tried to rationalize, to tell himself it was an elaborate scam. Maybe Abner had found a legal loophole in the lease agreements and was using this sentimental story to maximize his leverage. That would make sense in the business world, he knew. But the old man's calm, the lack of greed in his eyes, the mention of a promise, it didn't fit any negotiation tactic, he knew. There was an authenticity to Abner that terrified him. Upon arriving at the ranch, a full moon bathed the landscape in a silvery light, revealing the silhouette of the main house, an old but sturdy structure surrounded by a silence only the countryside possesses. The house was exactly as he remembered from his last visit years ago for his father's funeral. The key was still under the same potted fern on the porch. The air inside the house was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. Furniture covered in white sheets looked like ghosts waiting to tell their stories. His father's office was at the end of the hall. The door creaked open, revealing a room frozen in time. The large mahogany desk, the worn leather chair, the shelves filled with books on agriculture and management, and, behind the desk, the painting. It was an oil painting of a rural landscape, the same one he could now see out the window. With trembling hands, J.R. lifted the painting from the wall, revealing the small built-in metal safe. The childhood memory returned with force. He remembered watching his father turn the dial, but he'd never paid attention to the combination. Desperation began to set in. How would he open it? He tried his father's birthday, his mother's, his own. Nothing. He sank into the leather chair, which groaned under his weight, and ran his hands over his face, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, his empire, his fortune, his identity, all locked behind a small steel door. He looked around, searching for inspiration, and his eyes landed on a small picture frame on the desk. It was an old, faded photo of him and his father, fishing at a lake. On the back, in James's elegant cursive, "The greatest treasure isn't gold, my son, but the bonds that unite us." And below it, a series of numbers. E08, E04, 78. Not a birth date. He stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs, and spun the dial with the sequence. The safe door opened with a soft metallic click. The metallic click of the safe door sounded in the silent office like the strike of a gavel, sentencing the end of his certainties. J.R. pulled the small steel door open, and a gust of stale air, smelling of old paper and guarded secrets, escaped from within. For a moment, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the dark contents. Whatever was in there had the power to redefine his life, to turn the solid rock of his history into quicksand. Curiosity, however, mixed with a visceral fear, was stronger. He reached in and felt around the velvet bottom, finding a bundle of papers tied with a faded string and a small, black, leather-bound journal. He pulled the items out and placed them on the mahogany desk, the dust dancing in the faint light of his phone. The first document he untied was, indeed, the carbon copy of the land lease agreement, just as Abner had said, bearing the unmistakable signatures of his father, James Powell Sr., and a much younger Abner Hayes. The dates confirmed the old rancher's story. The contracts were automatically renewed every decade, and the final term had expired the day before. But it wasn't the contracts that held his attention, it was the letters attached to them. Letters exchanged between his father and Abner over 40 years. His father's handwriting, firm and assertive in business dealings, became soft and almost reverent in these correspondences. He wrote about the harvests, about the health of Abner's family, about the struggles of Empire Motors' early years. In one letter, dated from the early 80s, James wrote, "My friend Abner, without your gesture, without your blind faith in a young dreamer, none of this would exist. Empire Motors wouldn't even be dust. My debt to you isn't one of capital but of soul, and that I know I can never repay. A debt of soul." The phrase hit J.R. with the force of a punch. He leafed through the letters, one after another, and the image of his father as a self-made titan began to crumble, replaced by that of a man who had been helped, who had been lifted up by a friendly hand in a moment of desperation. The man he had humiliated in the showroom wasn't just any creditor. He was his family's anonymous guardian angel, the silent foundation upon which all his wealth had been built. Finally, he picked up the small black journal. The pages were yellowed, and the ink from his father's pen had faded in places. The first entry was dated nearly 50 years ago, when James was just a young mechanic with a dream too big for his cramped garage. He chronicled the struggle to get a loan, the closed doors, the scorn from bank managers. "Everyone sees the size of my dream," he had written, "but no one sees the size of my will." Then the name Abner Hayes appeared. James described him as a rancher who could barely read or write, but who possessed a wisdom no university could teach. Abner had no money to invest. His only asset was the land, an inheritance from his ancestors. And it was this land that he offered, not as an investment, not in exchange for stock or dividends, but as collateral. He had mortgaged his own ranch, his only asset, so that a young dreamer he barely knew could get the seed capital to open his first car dealership. "He bet everything he had on me," James wrote on the next page, the ink smudged as if by a tear. He didn't ask for interest. He didn't ask for a share of the profits. He asked for only one thing, that I never forget where I came from, and that when I became a rich and powerful man, I would use that strength to help others, as he had helped me. The journal fell from J.R.'s hands, the promise, the debt. It wasn't about money. It was about honor. It was about gratitude. And he, in his blind arrogance, had spat on all of it. The weight of the humiliation he had inflicted on Abner now transferred to his own shoulders, crushing him. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the vast, dark expanse of the plains. For the first time in his life, J.R. felt truly poor. The night deepened, but sleep was an unattainable luxury. J.R. remained in his father's office, the light from his phone casting long, dancing shadows on the silent furniture. The black journal lay open on the desk, a mute testament to the truth he had spent his entire life ignoring. Every word written by his father's hand was a piece of a puzzle that, now assembled, revealed a completely different picture of the man he idolized. James Powell Sr. was not the Midas who turned everything to gold by himself. He was a man who had the humility to accept help, the wisdom to recognize a good soul, and the honor to carry a debt of gratitude for his entire life. And J.R., his heir, the guardian of his legacy, had proven himself unworthy of it all. The memory of the scene in the showroom haunted him, replaying in his mind like a cruel film. The contempt in his own voice, the mocking laughter, the arrogant gesture of having the man who was, in fact, the pillar of his fortune thrown out. Shame was a hot coal in his chest, burning with an intensity that no financial loss had ever caused him. He realized that his pursuit of wealth and status had blinded him to the values his father secretly had cherished most. While J.R. prided himself on the exponential growth of his business, the record profits, and his ever-increasing net worth, James, in those yellowed pages, spoke of the importance of one's word, of loyalty, and of a firm handshake. J.R. collected assets. His father had collected bonds. The shock of the revelation opened a fissure in his perception of the world. He had always believed that money was the ultimate measure of all things, the universal tool that could solve any problem, buy any loyalty, silence any objection. Offering Abner double, triple, in dollars or euros, had been his instinctive reaction, the response of a man who only knew how to speak the language of capital, and Abner's silent refusal, the look of disappointment, now made painful sense. The old rancher hadn't wanted his money. He wanted something J.R. perhaps had never possessed, character. As dawn tinted the sky in shades of grey and orange, a new determination began to form amid the chaos of his feelings, threatening Abner with lawyers, trying to buy his silence. All of it now seemed childish and pathetic. There was only one path forward, a path that didn't involve contracts, clauses, or negotiations. It involved swallowing his pride, facing the consequences of his actions, and, perhaps for the first time, acting not as a CEO, but as the son of James Powell Sr., the son of a man who understood the value of a promise. He had to find Mr. Abner, not to renegotiate the leases, not to save his dealerships, but to ask for forgiveness. The idea was terrifying. To ask for forgiveness was to admit weakness, a concept he had always associated with failure. But at that moment, in the silence of his father's ranch, he realized that true weakness was the arrogance that had guided him until then. He took the journal and the letters, storing them with a care he had never dedicated to any profitability report. These old papers were now the map to his redemption. He didn't know where Abner lived, but the ranch foreman, a man named Bo who had worked for his family since before he was born, would surely know. As he left the office and closed the door behind him, J.R. felt that he wasn't just leaving a room, but an entire chapter of his life. The drive back to the city would be different. The destination was no longer the top of his empire of glass and steel, but the humble doorstep of a man to whom his family owed everything, and he had no idea how he would be received. The morning sun found J.R. on the porch of the ranch house, his father's journal still in his hands. The world seemed different. The country air, which he had once found insignificant, now had a smell of earth and truth that the air in his Manhattan office never could. The luxury of his car, parked under a sprawling oak tree, suddenly seemed hollow, a gleaming shell devoid of a soul. For the first time, he understood that his father's true fortune was not listed on the stock exchange, nor was it held in high-yield investments. It was here, in these invisible bonds, in the memory of a promise honored for decades. He locked the house, placing the keys back in the same old spot, and walked toward the small cabin where Bo, the foreman, lived. He found the old man mending a fence, his hands as calloused and wrinkled as Abner's. Seeing J.R. approach, Bo took off his straw hat, a customary gesture of respect, but there was a wariness in his eyes. J.R. didn't use the tone of command he always had. His voice came out low, stripped of its usual arrogance. "Morning, Bo. I need a favor. I need to find Mr. Abner Hayes. Do you know where he lives?" The foreman's expression changed, the wariness giving way to a deep sadness. He stuck his hammer in the ground and leaned on the fence, sighing. "I know where Mr. J.R. Finding the man is easy. The hard part will be finding his spirit." J.R.'s blood ran cold. "What do you mean by that?" Bo looked toward the horizon, at the dry hills that stretched as far as the eye could see. "This year's drought was the worst in 50 years, sir. Wiped out everything. The cattle got thin, the pasture turned to dust, the creek ran dry. Mr. Abner, he's a strong one, an old oak. But even the strongest oak cracks when there's no water." The revelation began to take shape in J.R.'s mind, a terrible and ironic truth. "He's in financial trouble?" J.R. asked, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "Trouble is an understatement," Bo replied, shaking his head. "He tried everything, sold what he could, but the bank's interest payments don't forgive a drought. The Clear Creek Ranch. The same land he put up as collateral for your father to get his start. The bank's about to foreclose. He went to the city as a last resort, had some smaller plots he thought he could sell, raise some emergency capital, but after what happened at your dealership, he came back with nothing left. J.R. Westworld spun. The humiliation he had caused wasn't just an act of cruelty, it was the final blow to a man already on his knees. Abner hadn't gone to his showroom to confront him, but perhaps in search of one last, desperate hope that he, J.R., had crushed with his words. He saw the reflection of the same cold, merciless financial world that was about to destroy Abner in his own behavior. The bank wanted the rancher's assets. He, in his arrogance, had attacked his dignity. Where is he now, Bo? I have to go there. Now. The urgency in J.R.'s voice was real, desperate. Bo stared at him for a long moment, as if measuring the weight of his sincerity. Finally, he nodded. It's 2 hours from here, heading south, Clear Creek Ranch, but if you're really going... The foreman paused, his gaze grave. You'd better hurry. Why? What's happening? Bo picked his hat up off the ground and placed it back on his head, the shadow covering his eyes. The county sheriff is heading out there tomorrow morning, sir. To serve the final eviction notice. The auction for the land is already on the books. The next 2 hours on the road were a blur of asphalt and arid landscapes. J.R. drove with a feverish urgency that came not from speed, but from the weight of time slipping away. Every mile covered was one less second on the countdown to Abner's ruin. The irony of the situation was crushing. He, the multimillionaire worried about the future of his luxury dealerships, had discovered that the true legacy at risk belonged to the man he had despised. J.R.'s empire was a giant with feet of clay, and the clay was Abner's land, now about to be swallowed by the drought and the coldness of a financial system that knew no gratitude. He thought in terms familiar to him. Abner's liability was immense, not just financially, but emotionally. The most valuable asset, the land, was about to be liquidated for a fraction of its true value, not its market value, but the value of a lifetime of work and a heritage of generations. The cash flow had dried up along with the creek, and he, J.R., with his fortune in dollars and his high-yield investments, had been the final push into the abyss. Clear Creek Ranch wasn't hard to find, but it was painful to see. The wooden gate, once sturdy, was sagging, one of its posts having given way. The dirt road leading to the main house was cracked from the drought, and dust rose in thick clouds behind his car, coating the yellowed brush. There were no cattle in sight. The house was simple but dignified, with a wide porch and walls that had once been white. Now the paint was peeling, and the wood of the window frames looked desiccated. It was a portrait of resilience at its limit, a place that had fought bravely but was losing the battle. And there, sitting in a rocking chair on the porch, was Mr. Abner. He didn't look at the luxury car as it approached. His gaze was lost on the horizon, fixed on the brown, dusty land that stretched out under the merciless sun. There was no anger on his face, nor the authoritative calm he had shown at the dealership. There was only a profound exhaustion, the resignation of a dethroned king, brought down not by an enemy army, but by the betrayal of nature itself and the cruelty of men. J.R. parked the car and got out, feeling like an intruder, a vulture in his expensive suit. He walked slowly, the sound of his leather shoes on the dry ground seeming like a profanation. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, unsure of what to say. All his negotiation skills, all his business rhetoric were useless here. "Mr. Abner," he began, his voice little more than a whisper. The old rancher turned his head slowly, his clear eyes landing on J.R. without surprise, only with an infinite weariness. "You come to watch the end of the show, son?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Come to make sure the old man who dirtied your floor gets what he deserves." The bitterness in his words was understandable, and J.R. accepted it as a penance. He climbed the steps and stopped a few feet from Abner, holding his father's journal against his chest. "No, I came to ask for forgiveness." He opened the journal, his hands trembling. "I read it. I know everything. I know what you did for my father. I know about the promise, and I know that the man who greeted you in my showroom was not the son James Powell deserved to have." Abner's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the journal, a flicker of recognition in the midst of his apathy. He looked at the small black book and then back at J.R. "Oh, James kept that." His voice broke for a moment. "He never forgot, not for a single day," J.R. replied, feeling a lump form in his throat. "He left me an inheritance, a great fortune, but he hid the real treasure, and I was too blind to see it. His debt wasn't about business, it was about honor, and I dishonored it." He took a step forward. "Tomorrow, the sheriff isn't taking anything from here. I won't allow it. My father's debt won't be paid with money. It will be paid with honor." Abner stared at him, skepticism warring with a spark of hope in his tired face. Just as the silence became almost unbearable, the sound of another engine breaking the country quiet made them both turn. A new, gleaming pickup truck, far more suited to this terrain than J.R.'s sedan, pulled up beside his car. From the driver's side emerged a middle-aged man with a smug grin and snakeskin boots. He looked at the house, at Abner, and finally at J.R. with a glint of avarice in his eyes. Well, the newcomer said, "looks like I'm just in time for the foreclosure party." The man who stepped out of the truck was the personification of greed. His name was Silas Thorne, a new generation rancher known in the region for building his wealth on the ruins of neighboring farms. He didn't cultivate the land, he devoured it. To him, the countryside wasn't a home or a legacy. It was a game board, and he was an aggressive player who delighted in capturing the weakest pieces. His smug grin wasn't just a personality trait, it was his primary tool of intimidation. He looked at Abner, shrunken in his rocking chair, with the contempt of a predator that has cornered its prey. Abner, Silas said, approaching the porch, his snakeskin boots making a dry crunch on the earth. "I told you that your stubbornness, your refusal to modernize, to treat the ranch like a real business, was going to put you under a shame. Such good land with such low profitability." Every word was a small jab, calculated to maximize the humiliation. Abner just lowered his head, the weariness on his shoulders seeming to weigh a ton. He had no fight left in him. Silas then turned his attention to J.R., surprise and interest gleaming in his eyes. "J.R. Powell, the billionaire from the city. What brings you to our humble backwater? Came to buy up the assets at auction. I thought you only made big-ticket investments with profits in the millions." The mockery was blatant. J.R. felt his blood boil. In this man, he saw a distorted, grotesque mirror of himself, the man he had been less than 24 hours ago. The same language, the same obsession with profit, the same disregard for human dignity. Silas spoke of Abner's land as an asset to be liquidated, of a man's life as a liability to be written off. The shame he felt for his own actions transformed into a cold, focused anger. "I didn't come for an auction," J.R. said, his voice firm, surprising even himself. "I came to settle a debt of honor my family owes Mr. Abner." Silas let out a loud, unpleasant laugh. "A debt of honor? How poetic! But honor doesn't pay interest, Mr. Powell. And Abner's debt to the bank is very real. The dividends this land failed to produce for years will now be paid with the land itself." He leaned against a porch post, crossing his arms, looking like he owned the place. "But don't you worry. I'll take good care of it. I'm going to turn this sanctuary of yours, Abner, into something that actually makes a profit." J.R. stepped forward, placing himself between Silas and the old rancher. "This land is not for sale, and there will be no auction. I'm going to pay off the debt, all of it, now." He pulled his phone from his pocket, the gesture as natural to him as a rancher drawing a knife. He was ready to mobilize his capital, to wire whatever was necessary and end this. The fortune he had amassed, which had once served only his ego, now had a purpose. For the first time, his money seemed to have real value. Silas's grin, however, didn't waver. If anything, it grew wider and more wicked. He shook his head as if amused by a child's naivete. "Oh, Mr. Powell, you and your habit of thinking money solves everything. It's adorable, really, but you're a little late to the party." J.R. stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" Silas pushed himself off the post and took a step toward him, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, victorious tone. "You see, I'm a businessman. I don't wait for things to happen. I make them happen. I wasn't about to risk losing this jewel in a public auction, so I got proactive." He paused dramatically, savoring the moment. "I bought his debt from the bank, the mortgage, the interest, all of it. The creditor, Mr. Powell, is no longer a faceless bank. It's me." Silas's revelation fell into the dry country air like poison. For J.R., it was as if the ground he had just found beneath his feet had opened up again. All his life, money had been his weapon, his shield, and his universal language. A problem arose. He wrote a check. An opportunity appeared. He mobilized his capital. It was a game he dominated, a simple equation of assets and liabilities. But Silas, with his predator's grin, had changed the rules. Capital versus capital was a battle J.R. would always win. But this was different. Silas didn't want his money. He wanted the land, the symbol of his victory, the trophy of his conquest over old Abner. For the first time in his adult life, J.R. felt powerless, his vast fortune as useless as a handful of sand against the tide. He glanced at Abner. The old rancher seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 seconds. The last spark of hope in his eyes was extinguished, leaving only a gray, desolate void. He shrank back in his chair, a man already surrendered, merely awaiting the final blow. "You see, Mr. Powell," Silas continued, delighting in the effect of his words, "this isn't about inheritances or promises from a dead man. This is about business, vision. I saw an opportunity, a high-value asset being mismanaged, and I made an investment. I bought the paper for a fraction of its worth, a guaranteed profit. The bank was happy to offload a liability, and I was happy to acquire a promising future." He gestured toward the vast expanse of the ranch. "Now, all of this is legally mine by right of collection, and I intend to collect." The cold, ruthless logic was the same J.R. had used his entire life. But hearing it from another's mouth, used as a weapon to destroy a good man, made him nauseous. This was the gospel of wealth he had always preached, and now he saw its ugliness in its purest form. He remembered his father's words in the journal, "The greatest treasure isn't gold, my son, but the bonds that unite us." He had viewed those bonds as sentimentality, as weaknesses. Now he saw they were the only thing that mattered. J.R. took a deep breath, the anger and despair transforming into an icy clarity. If Silas wanted to play a business game, then they would play, but it wouldn't be on his terms. "How much did you pay for the debt?" J.R. asked. His voice controlled. Silas laughed. "Confidential information, Mr. Powell, but you can be sure it was an excellent deal for me." "I'll pay you double," J.R. said. "No, triple, in cash. Now, an immediate cash flow injection for your other ventures." The mention of other ventures made Silas hesitate for a fraction of a second, a flicker of interest crossing his eyes before being replaced by arrogance. "Not interested. The profit potential of this land, in my hands, is worth far more. Now, if you'll excuse me, I just came to give notice. The sheriff will be here in the morning with the eviction order. I suggest you have your things packed. Abner." He turned to leave, complete victory written across his face. J.R. felt a rising panic. He had hours, not days, to find a solution. His mind, trained to find patterns and weaknesses in balance sheets and market reports, began to race. Every businessman, no matter how clever, had a weak point, a leverage point, a hidden liability. Silas was arrogant, overconfident, and men like that, in their haste to grab a profit, often left tracks. As Silas walked away, J.R. noticed a detail on the side of the man's gleaming truck, a small decal with the logo of an agribusiness company, Agro-Strong Grains. A name that seemed vaguely familiar. In an instant, a memory sparked in his mind. A market analysis he'd read weeks ago about mid-sized companies seeking capital for expansion, some with questionable financial practices. It was a long shot, a stab in the dark, but it was the only weapon he had. He turned to Abner, who was watching him with empty eyes. "It's not over yet," J.R. said, with a conviction he didn't feel but needed to project. "He wants to play the business game. Then we'll show him how the real billionaires play." Night fell on Clear Creek Ranch, not as a blanket of peace, but as a shroud. Abner refused to leave the porch, remaining in his rocking chair like a captain going down with his ship. J.R. sat on the steps, his laptop open on his knees, the bright screen a stark contrast to the growing darkness. The silence between them was profound, filled only by the chirping of crickets and the frantic clicking of keys under J.R.'s fingers. He wasn't searching for a path to redemption. He was at war. A war fought not with weapons, but with data, balance sheets, and the complex web of the financial market. Agro-Strong Grains, Silas's company, was his target. Using the powerful satellite internet from his car, he dove deep into his adversary's corporate world. The company wasn't publicly traded, which made accessing detailed information difficult. But nothing is truly invisible in the world of big business. There are public records, permits, lawsuits, invoices, and J.R. was a master at following these trails. He spent hours cross-referencing information, discreetly contacting his analysts in New York, requesting urgent reports on agricultural commodities and export company movements. The picture that began to emerge was that of a house of cards. Silas was a speculator, not a producer. He used Agro-Strong Grains to secure massive loans, leveraging the company's assets to buy the debts of other ranchers like Abner and then foreclose on them. He didn't sow, he reaped. His profit came not from the land, but from the desperation of others. The crucial discovery came around 2 a.m. One of his analysts, a young crypto market prodigy J.R., had hired for his skill in finding hidden patterns, sent an encrypted file. It was a copy of an export contract. Agro-Strong Grains had closed a massive deal to supply thousands of tons of soybeans to a European conglomerate. It was Silas's golden goose, the deal that would elevate him from a regional aggressor to an international player. But there was a detail, a tiny clause in the contract that made J.R.'s heart race. The European company was extremely strict about its environmental and compliance policies. The contract stipulated that all production must come from lands with sustainability certification, and that none of its suppliers could be involved in land ownership disputes or business practices deemed predatory. Silas had signed it, likely without paying close attention, confident that no one would ever connect his debt acquisition business with his export operations. J.R. smiled in the dark. He had found the hidden liability, the chink in Silas's armor. He didn't need more money. He needed information. And in the business world, information was the most valuable asset of all. He spent the rest of the night preparing his strategy, drafting emails, making calls to contacts in Europe. He wasn't trying to destroy Silas. He was just ensuring the truth came to light. He was about to show Silas that when you play in the Billionaires League, the rules are far more complex. As dawn broke, The first rays of sun touching the dry earth, JR closed his laptop. He felt exhausted, but possessed a clarity of purpose he had never experienced before. He stood and looked at Abner, who had fallen asleep in his chair, his wrinkled face marked by pain. At that moment, JR realized the battle wasn't just for Abner's ranch. It was for something bigger. It was a battle against the kind of man he himself had been becoming. The sound of approaching engines broke the morning silence. Silas's truck led the way, followed by a plain sedan that could only belong to the county sheriff. They pulled up, raising a cloud of dust. Silas got out with a triumphant grin, holding a folder. "Good morning, ready for the transition of assets." Jay Turner walked calmly to meet them, his phone in his hand. "I think there's been a change of plans, Silas." He turned the phone screen towards Silas. It displayed a copy of the email he had sent 2 hours earlier to the compliance department of the European conglomerate, with a carbon copy sent to the nation's leading financial newspapers. The subject line read, "Inquiry into predatory practices and violation of sustainability clause in agro-strong grains contract." Silas's smile vanished. Silas's face underwent a grotesque metamorphosis. The triumphant grin dissolved, replaced by a waxy pallor. His eyes, once sparkling with greed, were now wide with panic as he read and reread the text on J.R. Sim's phone. The email was a masterpiece of corporate precision, a legal neutron bomb that didn't destroy the building but annihilated the life within. It cited the specific clauses of the European contract, attached evidence of Silas's debt acquisition practices, and formally questioned agro-strong grains' compliance with the required ethical standards. It wasn't a threat. It was an execution. The sheriff, a weary-looking man who had until then remained on the sidelines, took an instinctive step back, as if the tension might materialize and explode. Abner, awakened by the confrontational tone, slowly raised his head, his eyes moving from Silas's impotent fury to J.R.'s glacial calm. This is a sham. Blackmail!" Silas stammered, his voice stripped of all its arrogance. You can't prove anything." "I don't have to prove it, Silas. I just have to ask the question," J.R. replied, his tone even lethal. "Their compliance department will do the rest. And while they investigate, your contract is suspended. Your payments, frozen. Your cash flow, which I know depends entirely on those euros, goes to zero. That contract wasn't just another deal in your portfolio. It was the collateral for all your other investments, the anchor for your entire net worth. Without it, the same banks that funded you to buy other ranches, debts will be coming for you. Your greatest asset just became your greatest liability. In a matter of hours, Silas, you'll be in the exact same position as Mr. Abner, actually worse, because he has friends. You, I doubt." Every word was a nail in the coffin of Silas's empire. The man staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his gleaming truck, at the land he coveted, and saw it all turning to smoke. His wealth, built on the ruin of others, was an illusion about to dissipate. It was then that Abner stood up. Slowly, pushing himself up on the arms of the chair, he got to his feet for the first time that morning. He looked at J.R., not at the billionaire from the city, but at the young man standing there, using his power not to oppress, but to defend. And in the old rancher's eyes, for the first time, J.R. saw not a creditor or a victim, but the reflection of his father's friend, the man who embodied the honor he was so desperately trying to reclaim. The ensuing silence was broken by J.R.'s voice, now directed at Silas, but carrying a weight that resonated with everyone present. "I don't want to destroy you, Silas. I want justice. And today, justice has a very clear price." He pointed to the folder in Silas's hand. "You're going to give me that folder, with the deed of debt and all the ownership papers. In return, I'll make a phone call. I'll tell my contacts in Europe that there was an administrative misunderstanding that has since been resolved. The inquiry will be shelved, you'll keep your contract, and you will never come near this ranch or Mr. Abner again. You have 10 seconds to decide if you'd rather lose one property or your entire fortune." The tension peaked. The morning sun beat down, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Silas, cornered, looked at the folder in his hand, the document that represented his victory, now the key to his survival. With a hand trembling with rage, he opened the folder, but instead of handing it over, he looked directly at Abner, a glint of pure hatred in his eyes, and began to rip the first document in half. The sound of tearing paper was an act of futile defiance, the last spasm of a defeated predator. For an instant, time seemed to freeze. The sheriff took an instinctive step forward, as if to intervene in an illegal act, forgetting that the document being destroyed was the very basis of his presence there. Abner didn't flinch, merely watching Silas's act with an ancient sadness, as if seeing not an enemy, but a man drowning in his own poison. Before Silas could tear the second page, J.R.'s hand clamped down on his wrist with the force of a steel vise. "Don't be a bigger fool than you've already been." J.R.'s voice was low, but carried an authority Silas had never heard before. The eye contact between them was brief but decisive. Silas saw in J.R. not just the power of money, but a relentless determination he could not fight. The rage in his face withered. Replaced by the bitter acceptance of defeat, he let the torn paper fall and held out the folder to J.R. J.R. took the folder and handed it to Abner. "This is yours, or rather, it always was," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't bother to hide. Abner held the folder with trembling hands, looking at it as if it were a sacred artifact. He looked up at J.R., and words weren't necessary. His eyes, clear and filled with tears, conveyed a gratitude and a recognition that were worth more than any profit J.R. had ever made in his life. Silas, defeated, turned without a word and walked back to his truck. The sheriff, looking awkward, just mumbled, "Excuse me," and retreated, his purpose there having evaporated. The sound of Silas's truck engine starting and driving away was the sound of a siege ending, the retreat of a tide that had threatened to swallow everything. Alone again on the porch, under a sun that now seemed to warm rather than punish, a new silence settled. It was not the silence of tension or despair, but of peace and resolution. "Thank you, son," Abner said finally, his voice hoarse. The word son struck J.R. with an unexpected force, filling a void he didn't even know he had. "I only did what I was supposed to," J.R. replied, shaking his head. "I came here to honor my father's debt, but I found out the debt was mine, a debt to the values he tried to teach me and that I ignored." He looked out at the ranch, at the dry land that somehow now seemed full of life and promise. "The lease agreements for my dealerships, they're still cancelled." Abner looked at him, surprised. "But why? After all this, because my father didn't want me to just be an heir to his business. He wanted me to be a partner, and that's what I want to propose to you." J.R. stepped closer, his voice full of a new energy. "Let's turn Empire Motors and Clear Creek Ranch into a partnership. Your land, my infrastructure. We'll invest in irrigation technology, recover the pasture, bring back the cattle stronger than before. The profits from the Heartland dealerships will be reinvested right here, in the land that gave them their start. I don't want to just lease your land anymore, Mr. Abner. I want you to be my partner, so that the value you created can continue to grow, and so that I never again forget where it all began." The proposal hung in the air, radical and unexpected. Abner looked at the horizon, at his land, and then at the young man before him. A smile, the first genuine smile J.R. had seen on his face, began to form, creating new furrows in his sun-beaten skin. It was a smile that represented more than a business deal. It was the closing of a circle, the joining of two generations, the true repayment of a debt of soul. "James," Abner whispered, looking up at the sky, "you did a good job with him, my friend. He just needed a little push." He extended his hand to J.R., the same thick, earth-stained hand that had once secured the dream of a young mechanic, and J.R. shook it, sealing not a contract, but a promise. A year later, the white marble floor of the Empire Motors showroom in Manhattan still gleamed. But J.R. no longer saw it in the same way. The cold shine of luxury had been replaced by the warm light of purpose. He spent less time in the capital skyscraper and more time at Clear Creek Ranch, which had been reborn from its ashes. Where there had once been only cracked earth and dust, now stretched a verdant carpet of pasture, irrigated by a modern center pivot system, an investment he had made with pleasure. The prime breed cattle grazed, fat and healthy, and the creek, once dry, ran clear and full again, thanks to the construction of small retention dams. The ranch was not just a productive asset on his balance sheet. It was the beating heart of a new kind of empire. The partnership between him and Abner was thriving. A portion of the profits from the Heartland dealerships was religiously reinvested in the land, funding technology, creating jobs in the region, and turning Clear Creek into a model of sustainable and humane business. The old cattle king was no longer a lonely monarch. He was the patriarch of a community that flourished along with his land. That afternoon, J.R. was on the porch of the house, now renovated but maintaining its dignified simplicity. His leather boots were not designer, but work boots, and they were stained with the same red clay he had once so despised. He and Abner were drinking strong coffee, looking out at the horizon. The silence between them was comfortable, that of two men who understood each other without needing many words. "Your father would be proud," Abner said, breaking the silence. "He always knew the greatest wealth isn't what you hoard, but what you sow." J.R. smiled, a genuine smile that now came to him easily. "It took me 35 years to understand what he meant by treasure. I was too busy counting my net worth in dollars, my stocks, my gold, to realize the real capital was right here, in a man's word, in loyalty, and in gratitude." He had changed. The ruthless CEO had given way to a leader who understood that the greatest dividend a man can receive is the respect of his people and peace in his heart. His city businesses continued to thrive, but his focus was different. He had established a foundation to support small farmers in difficulty, offering them the same kind of help Abner had once offered his father, a bet on honor, with no interest, only the promise that they pay the kindness forward. He was still a multimillionaire, but his fortune now had a soul. He had discovered that it was possible to generate profit and, at the same time, generate well-being, that a company's cash flow could also be the flow of hope for a community. He looked at Abner, the old rancher who had become his moral compass, his mentor, and above all, his friend. His father's debt was finally paid, not with money, but with the continuation of his legacy of honor. The sun began to set, painting the sky with vibrant colors that reflected on the green fields. J.R. felt a peace that no high-yield investment had ever given him. He had lost his fear of getting his boots dirty, and in doing so,